So I'm going to talk about poetry and information theory, two very closely aligned topics. So I'm going to quickly discuss what poetry is because it's a surprisingly complicated question to answer. Then I'm going to describe what information theory is because although it has an exceedingly rigorous answer, maybe less people think they know what it is. Then I'll investigate whether poems are any good as a medium of communication, and then I'll be proving myself right or wrong by showing you some which have varying amounts of information in them. Right, so let's start by asking what a poem actually is. Samuel Taylor Coleridge once described poetry as the best words in the best order, and having been to many open mic nights, I can confirm he was wrong. But I'm going to use a slightly more general definition of poetry as when we are communicating, but aware of our communication on more different levels. So like normally when I talk, I'll think about the words and the sentences. I'll think about how to express my idea so that it forms sentences. And maybe there are paragraphs and higher level things, but you don't care so much about like the atoms of the words. You don't care about the syllables. You don't care about the bits inside the syllables. Whereas with poetry, you're looking at things like vowel rhymes, you're looking at rhyming in general, which are like at the sort of syllable level. You might be thinking about alliteration. It doesn't have to have any of these, but you'll at least be thinking about what the like lower levels of communication are doing. But also, poems are a bit more open-ended than prose. So with prose, the idea usually is that like you have an idea and you want to transmit that idea to someone else. Whereas a poem, it's acceptable to like let people go away and think about what the poem means. It doesn't have to have all the answers. And so like the openness of poetry to context is a little bit wider than I think prose normally is. But obviously there's overlap between these different categories. All right, so what's information theory? Well, it's what enables us to do basically everything these days. The question we're asking is how can you communicate in a world where things are noisy, and also maybe some people are nosy and shouldn't be on your chat. So we answer questions like, how do you do cryptography? How can you compress data so you can communicate more efficiently? And what happens if some of your data goes missing? So at the moment, we've got a really good example of this, right? You've got, so I've got a little camera here that's taking a photo of me and has different pixels in it, but it's not sending you those pixels. First of all, it converts those pixels into waves, because most pixels are pretty similar in color to the pixels next to them. So if some of the pixels went missing on the way, you just have like a row of black on your screen. But if some of the waves go away, and I've converted my image to waves, then you've just got a slightly blurry image. So if you've converted everything into this waveform, you can cut out some of the information and not notice it so badly. So if you have a lack of data because the communication is slow, your internet's bad, it's not such a big problem. It might also just compress it by throwing away some of the waves that it doesn't think are important if it expects the data to be slow. And yeah, Zoom does usually do all of these things. So in this sort of diagram here, I think you can see my mouse. So we've got the photo, we've converted it into waves, then we're sending it to you along the internet, and some of it might not get there in time to show for you. But hopefully most of it does, and at your end you can then decompress it and then convert it into the image that you see on your screen. So this is all of the aspects of information theory: the compression, the sending it in a way that you are satisfied that the recipient will be able to decompress it and then also see it. There's a few other problems, like how can you know that the recipient has actually received it, things like that. But we won't really go into detail because, well, this is to talk about poetry. The information can be measured in bits. You're probably quite familiar with bits from computers, so you know that your computer hard drive has so many bytes, and a byte is just 8 bits. So one bit cuts your uncertainty in half. And in information theory, we generally talk about things in terms of probability. So if you have a coin and it can be a head or a tail, you have 2 possibilities. But once I give you the 1 bit of information, I say it was a head, you now don't have 2 possibilities, you only have 1 possibility, so you know what it is. Similarly, if you have all these pixels and I only tell you half the information about them, if that is just what half the pixels are equal to, that's kind of not very helpful for assembling the whole image. But if I am clever about how I tell you what the pixels are, then only giving you half the information allows you to get a blurry image. Right. I said that this is like what you have on computers. There is an important difference. In information theory, we're talking about how many bits it would be if it were properly compressed. And you never really know that you've come up with the best way of compressing things, although some ways are definitely better than others. All you can do is try a compression method and see how small it is. And there's always the possibility that something could compress it into a smaller size, unless it's like just one bit. But in general, you can view information theory as like concerning bits that are very much like what you store on your computer if you've got good algorithms running. All right, so what does this mean for language? Right, in different languages, we obviously need different numbers of syllables to convey the same information. So on this graph, you can see on the sort of central column, there's this image of different languages and how many syllables people speaking that language typically speak per second. What this experiment did was it took some chunks of text, originally in English, translated them into all these different languages, and got people to read them aloud. And you'll see that, like some languages, they're all saying much the same thing, but in some languages, it takes them a lot longer to say a syllable. However, on the far right side here, we've got the IR, the information rate. So this is the rate at which you finish saying whatever block of text it is that you that conveys the idea that's been translated. And here you can see that there's a really clear peak in this so on this line here. So most languages have an average that's within this dotted line here for the information rate, even if there's a huge spread over here of different languages when they're talking about syllables. So what this means that in languages where there aren't very many syllables, so the top language is Japanese. Japanese only has a couple of hundred syllables total. English, by contrast, has quite a few thousand. So there are many more syllables that I could be saying than if I were speaking in Japanese right now. However, if I were speaking in Japanese, I would probably be speaking even faster. Would depend on who I was. Obviously, different people speak at different speeds, and you see that represented here. So German, for instance, has a huge range at which people speak. But in general, languages where there aren't so many syllables, or for some other reason you need to say more syllables to convey the same idea, tend to speak faster and tend to give away information at the same rate. I'll point out that English and French do look a little bit faster in terms of information rate than the others, but I wouldn't read too much into that because the study did originally have English text. So it is possible that some languages just have better words for certain ideas, and that shouldn't be interpreted as saying like English and French are necessarily better, because if like the original text was in Hungarian, maybe Hungarian will be slightly better at conveying that idea because it just has a better word for the thing you're trying to describe. So on the whole, most languages transmit information around 39 bits per second. That's obviously going to depend a lot on who you are and how you are. That is interestingly true when you're talking about reading languages as well. So although Chinese has only one character that expresses a lot of ideas, a Chinese person will take about as long to read a sentence with the same idea as an English person. However, because the way that Chinese characters work, it's quicker to type a Chinese sentence than an English one. Generally, when people type, they are more constrained by actually moving their fingers than they are by the ideas themselves. So it's not necessarily the case that all languages are exactly equal for all things, but some languages have like particular uses that like make it easier to type than others. This is from a study by Coupe et al. From last year. So how surprising is a poem then? I'm going to start off with the most poem-y poem that I could think of. This is Shakespeare's Sonnet 116. It's anthologized in loads of places. No one would question that this is definitely a poem-y poem. So if he has done something wrong, it's definitely because he intended it to go that way. So it's a sonnet. Sonnets have quite a lot of rules. They're supposed to be in iambic pentameter, which means they go da-dum, 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 da-dum. So 5 sets of da-dum, emphasis on the second beat. They're supposed to have end rhymes. There's like a few different rhyme schemes they could have, but it's always at the end of the line. And yeah, they always have 14 lines in total. But when you actually look at this, you'll see that he kind of mostly follows the rules, but there are a few reasons that he's kind of like broken the rules a little bit. So the I ams don't always follow. So like you might say, let me not to the marriage of true minds, but probably you'd read that as let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. So it's not really in I ams. You can argue, like, did he do this because it's really hard to write in I ams? Or did he do this because he wants to create a sense of unease or expectation of like something going wrong? I'll leave you to make that up. You make your mind up on that. I personally don't think that Shakespeare's all he's cracked up to be, but we can definitely have that argument some other time. He definitely breaks the rules of how grammar normally works in order to get words that sound nice together. That's something that you're not normally allowed to in English, but you're allowed to do in poetry. And he requires, so he does always stick to the 10 syllables per line, but sometimes you have to pronounce a word wrong to get that way. So you have to say fixed mark rather than fixed mark, which is like normally you just say fixed as one syllable. Some of the things aren't his fault. Like in his day, you could rhyme proved and loved. You can't anymore. That just sounds weird. Language changes. We have to just get used to that fact. But it does now kind of sound a bit strange that he's even trying to do that. And it's noteworthy that the word love is used in a lot of poetry, in spite of the fact that it's actually quite difficult to rhyme it with other words these days. Like other than glove and dove, we kind of don't have that many other words. So Shakespeare, like the fact that he tried to rhyme proved and remove with love, it really grates now because he does that in quite a lot of his poems because there are so few different words that you can use. And if you've said you're going to rhyme, you just have to reuse words in this way. So because he's tried to make his words follow a rule, he's cut down the sort of space of possible sentences that he could construct to this smaller set, which can only express certain ideas and are almost forced to refer to certain things like proving and removing things because he wants them to rhyme with love and he wants to talk about love. But not all poetry follows loads of rules, right? So here's an example of something by E.E. Cummings, and you do have to spell his name with lowercase letters. It's called !Black without a K. There is a K when you read the whole thing. I'm not going to read the whole thing aloud because I have no idea how you actually do that. It is almost a sentence if you just read between the lines. But yeah, it doesn't really follow any of the normal rules of grammar, line breaks, punctuation. So I think it's fair to say that if you were trying to predict this, you'd have less luck than with prose. So whereas with the Shakespeare one, he ends a line with a love, you can kind of guess that the rhyming line is going to end with one of about 10 different words because there just aren't that many other words that rhyme. Whereas here, there's no rhyme, there's no rhythm, and also there's no grammar. So I have less idea what's going to happen on another line than I would do in normal conversation. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be talking more about the rule-based poetry because it's the sort that I prefer to write and I find kind of more challenging. Like there's fewer ways to work out whether E.E. Cummings is going wrong or when he's just exploring something and it's kind of fun. So I couldn't readily tell you whether this was his poem that he thought was a masterpiece or whether this was just one of the bits that he cut out of another poem in order to make something that itself would be a masterpiece. Like there's not really any way of me judging that. So I think E.E. Cummings is great, but I'm not going to really talk about this style of poetry very much in this talk. I'm going to try instead and discuss the least surprising poem that I've constructed. So this is a poem, I'll just read it for you and you can see what you think of it. Try and consider this from an information point of view. Set, set, sets, set, sets, sets. Sets, set, set, sets, set, sets, set, sets. At this point, you can probably guess what the next line is going to sound like before I've actually said it. While at the same time, you probably don't really know what the last line said. So I'm just going to give you a translation of those two lines that you've heard there. So Set is an Egyptian god, that's with two T's. Set with a C and a ETE is a group of badgers. So the Egyptian god set gives a group of badgers a specific collection of mathematical groups. I've written mathematical group sets in curly brackets to represent that. That's how you say it in maths. So sets is the Egyptian god is giving this group of badgers a collection of mathematical objects. And then the next line, this mathematical group is going to be used to determine the badgers' academic groupings in set theory, their set sets, obviously. So in case you were wondering what the next two lines are, I'll just read it for you. Sets. Okay, so I don't know whether you managed to follow that. Just in case you didn't. Groups of badgers, so sets of badgers that this god set has given these mathematical groups to, the first line, give those groups to other groups of badgers. All right, so this is a poem which could very easily be compressed a lot smaller, because I could just represent the different word sets as like, in writing, I could write all of the different word sets which are written the same way with one symbol. I could just say set type 1, set type 2, or set with a C. I could condense this quite a lot because it's reusing the same words in different ways. In speech, it's even easier than writing because on the page, you've got different types of sets. But when I say sets, you don't really know which type of sets I'm meaning. So I can compress the spoken version even further than I can compress the written version. So in that way, it's the least surprising poem. Obviously, I can only say certain things in this way. If I want to make a poem about something more interesting than Egyptian gods teaching badgers maths, I'm going to have to think very hard about it, and probably I'll just fail unless I set out to give you an alphabet of ways that I can represent other letters using repetitions of a word set or something like that. You really would not want to read a poem like that. But it is possible, if you try, to write about slightly more technologically literate things using constrained poetry. So I'm going to do another poem for you now. This poem is going to be about climate changes, which is what I actually study most of the time. The rule is going to be, has to have rhythm and rhyme, and all of the words with more than 3 letters must contain a C and an O. Carbon concentrations rocket. Consequences catastrophic. For the concentrations control atmospheric optic echoes. Our cocooning gas contorts a comfy day to be a scorcher as our oceans all become acidulous and one by one force low-coast locals all to run. Avaricious for resources, carbon coffers cloud discourses, woo political discord by reproaching consumer forces. In draconic economics, actors are conceived atomic, so we do not contemplate. Competitors cooperate. In a contactless context, we plot, condemn the concept of social cost, but touch converts cogs to community. To connect is to fix. If we connect oscillating electronics, elections, and ecologic, we can construct a collective economics. For we have but one air to lap up sin, and but one air to fan all kin. We are all lit by but one sun, we die and rot in but one bed, and all the gas our ash has fed can go up in one conflagration. All right, that was... I've got a housemate here specifically to provide applause at the necessary moments in time. Excellent. So that was definitely a real poem that said things. You may not understand all the things that it said because it was still a little bit convoluted to get around the rules, but it was definitely a poem that said something about a real topic. In case you are interested, we can ask me questions about the social cost of carbon in the topic of conversation afterwards. But yeah, that was about the idea that when you emit carbon, it has a social cost for other people. I'm going to stop sharing this in a minute. I'm going to do one more poem. This is about the idea that poetry is viral. So humans obviously like to remember things that are useful, right? So we want ideas that relate to something we actually care about. Poetry, I think, is when you try and make ideas more human-shaped. And that's obviously useful for trying to communicate ideas because you're thinking about how language actually works when you're trying to communicate it. So in a poem, you might try and make the idea relate to something that people already care about, and people usually care about people because that's how we're evolved to function. But you also want ideas to stick with people, right? We go to these events and probably we won't remember everything that we come across, but it'll be nice if we can take some ideas with us. We know that rhyming can kind of help with that, right? You have the idea that people remember rhymes slightly easier because you've got fewer possibilities. They don't make it certain that you can remember things, but in general, people do find it easier to remember the lyrics to songs than random strings of numbers, for instance. An important problem with this is you have to understand that the way other people are going to interpret things and the things other people will find meaningful aren't always the things you want them to find meaningful. And so when you're expressing things as a poem in that slightly more open-ended way, you just have to allow for the possibility that what people take from it isn't necessarily what you wanted them to take from it, but that hopefully it will stick with them in some other ways. So I'm going to do a poem about viruses now, because I suspect we all care quite a lot about viruses at the moment. It's going to relate to climate change as well, because that's obviously what I'm studying. And I guess it's me taking on the idea of humans as viruses. So yeah, this poem's called The Human Virus. Yes, humans are viruses, not just stylistically. Literal viruses hide in our genes. Nearly 1 part in 10 of the code to make me is a self-replicating nanomachine that was crystallized when it hitched a ride and decided to stay more than half alive, yet I'm doing fine. Over time, viruses realize that destroying their host will soon leave them exposed, so it's better to be just annoying at most. If it's really comfy, the virus gets homely. Its genes become yours, only clone themselves slowly. If you remember one thing from today, you can thank viral genes rearranging your brain, as your nerve endings keep sending viral code packets wrapped in viral coats to tell the right cells that it's worth staying close to make memories. And as mammals, we should give thanks to the virus that birthed us. The genes our mum's wombs use to know how to nurture, how tenderly they should be treating placentas and feeding the fetus like cute influenza. And most of Earth's viruses just kill bacteria, slide safely off our cell membrane's exterior. So to develop a microbe deterrent, our bodies made mucus, especially glupous and sticky, so viruses hold on inside of us, ready to kill any germs that collide with us. Note, please don't use your snot as an anti-bac gel. Yeah, it technically is, but that won't end well. The real point I'm here expressing is most of the viruses in my skin are blessings. We are all part virus. But what does that mean? What kind of virus do you want to be? I will just share my last slide that I have here in an exceedingly slick manner that is very slick. There we are. The idea that I want to communicate is that we obviously mostly think about, in information context, communicating between one computer and another computer. But really we want to communicate between humans. And humans all have their own preconceived notions. They all have their own odd ideas. I think it's helpful to just send out information and hope that some of it will resonate. Some information is more likely to resonate than other ideas. So I guess here are my ideas for you, and let me know what's resonated. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. That was fantastic. So as I said earlier, I'm unable to multitask, so I'm assuming that people have been posting questions in the chat. If you didn't, because I think I might have forgotten to tell you to do that earlier on, which is my failure as a host, and I'm very sorry. Please post your questions for Robin in the chat. Evie will be scouring through that chat. Hopefully she is better at multitasking than me to pick out the best. I'm just going to give her a couple more seconds to gather her thoughts and put a couple of points to you. So from the very earliest, I mean, bold move, going hard on Shakespeare at the beginning. I like that. Start strong. It was my, that sort of idea that you should prove to your teachers that you're confident with your ideas at school. I tried this once by critiquing Shakespeare. Which one was it? Oh, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? And my argument was that it was cliched. I think I failed to understand where perhaps those cliched notions had come from, and I think my teacher just laughed at me. But also, I mean, the idea of like what should rhyme. Surely one of the best lines in poetry is from the song "I'm as serious as cancer when I say that rhythm is a dancer." I mean that rhymes, doesn't it? That's poetry. But anyway, Evie, have you got some questions for Robin?
Yes, we have lots and lots of questions. I also want to point out that I think Robin has a blog with all poetry on it, so that should be plugged. And I definitely need to read that poem one more time to get all that information from it. So first question is, did the Badgers pass their A-levels? Sorry about that.
The Badgers do A-levels. I don't know that they do, I'm afraid. I don't think Egyptian gods are actually qualified to set exams. Sorry.
Right. Now for more serious questions. There's a question, how much does the concept of poem vary across different languages and cultures? And does that play a part in how we understand poems?
Yeah, so quite a lot. So firstly, I'm talking about the word, so I use the word iambic pentameter, right? And in English, that means one thing. But the word is actually Greek. And what it means in Greek is actually very different to what it means in English. So in English, we have this idea of emphasis going on certain parts of words. In Greek, what you have is some vowels are longer and some are shorter. So we've taken the idea and slightly twisted it. In Japanese, you have haikus and things like this, which usually talk about the total number of syllables. But in Japanese, you don't have stress at all in the same way that we do in English. So every syllable receives approximately equal amounts of stress. So you actually can't do anything like an iamb in Japanese, which is why they focus mostly just on the syllable counts. In Chinese, you can do things. So in Chinese, you have pitches. So you have ma, 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 and there are 4 of them. Anyway, ma is the other one, I think. Anyway, so you have these things, and then you can do different types of rhyme. You can do a pitch rhyme, which there's just nothing corresponding to that in English, because in English, the tone of my voice depends on how much I want to emphasize a word rather than what that word actually means. So all these things that certain languages give you to play around with are going to be different in the different languages. So like what the atoms are that you can play around with are depending on the language. But the idea that you're playing around with like the structure of the language is the same in all the languages.
Excellent. Next question is, how do we know how people pronounced words before there were recordings? So how do you know that that Shakespearean poem was meant to be pronounced in a certain way?
So actually, the fact that we know it was supposed to rhyme is really useful in this. And we can learn a lot about how, for instance, ancient Greek was pronounced by what was expected to rhyme at the time. So in this case, because he keeps putting prove and love in ways that you'd expect to rhyme, and at the time he did rhyme, that's actually a good bit of evidence. The other way you can think about it is looking at how different groups of people have diverged. So Shakespeare was writing around the time when people had started moving to the Americas. So you expect some people in America to sound different to people in England for reasons that relate to the way that they were talking at the time. So you can construct these like evolutionary tree diagrams in the same way that we talk about species evolving. You can talk about dialects evolving. And at some point, the dialects become separate languages, but for English, that hasn't happened since Shakespeare. Yeah, so you can sort of try and say, if this group of people pronounce it this way and this group of people pronounced it that way, can we like guess which of them was dominant at the time, and then try and work things out that way. Some of these things probably were also breaking the rules at the time, though. Like it's definitely the case that people used to be happier with giving extra syllables, like putting fixed ed, or I can't think of other examples, but in older like Victorian poetry, people often put something ed, and you're definitely supposed to emphasize the ed. That doesn't necessarily mean they always did that. It was just completely normal in poetry to just force things into your syllable count. But it was quite popular at the time, not necessarily normal in normal conversation.
Another question is there more information in a lyric than in a poem because it's augmented by other sound, music, or is there less because it gets diluted?
Okay, So in the lyric, removing the sound, so in principle, it's the same, right? You can just add music to, I don't want to step too much on what Beyonce has been doing in things. I think we might get into some arguments here. But in general, I would say that you can obviously set a poem to music and then it becomes a lyric. Like there's no fixed definition of what is a lyric and what is just a poem. I would say that it is often the case that lyrics feature more repetition. So you often get choruses in songs, which you don't usually get in poems. And I would say that certainly in a lot of rap music, it's considered acceptable to rhyme a word with itself, which is a bit of a no-no in poetry. It's not that there are no rappers who don't do this. It's just that there are certain conventions, and because there's more going on in a song, I think you can get away with more sloppy writing in a song and still be considered quite good, in a way that maybe if there wasn't a background rhythm or beat or melody going on, you wouldn't be allowed to do that without people raising eyebrows. Like a lot of song lyrics don't really make sense. Let's be honest.
That tells me that the next time I try to write a poem, I should really go for a rap song. But there is a follow-up question to the sound. How do we know how words sounded? And that is, do we know if this, what you just said, meant that proof sounded like love or the other way around?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I believe it's more that prove sounded like love, but I'm not really an expert in this. I think both of them sounded a bit different, but it's more in the direction of prove. Michaela is nodding. I don't know. I'm not actually a linguist, by the way, in case this isn't obvious. So if Michaela knows more than me, I'm very happy for her to come in at this point.
No, I was just nodding that you said the right thing, that actually they both sounded different from today. And I guess more like a love and prove. I mean, I'm not an expert in original pronunciation Shakespeare either, but that's what I think.
Yeah, good.
Wonderful. What are your thoughts about the future of language in line with threats of something like 1984's Newspeak and the ability to communicate information?
Interesting, isn't it? I think that the biggest threat we have at the moment is the loss of languages. So traditionally, like you can go to small Pacific islands and they'll have literally hundreds of different languages separated by not particularly large distances. These days, people are overwhelmingly focusing on learning English, maybe French, and maybe Chinese. Whereas, I'm using the word Chinese as if it's a single language, right? It's not a single language. There are loads of Chinese speakers who speak Mandarin who cannot understand a word that is being spoken by someone who is from like the Cantonese region. But these days, all Chinese students are learning Mandarin in schools. So although they might be able to know the accents of their parents, the regional dialects of their parents, like that's being lost over generations. So I think like the largest threat probably comes from that, rather than like the idea that because we're all talking to each other, we're all seeking out the easiest ways of talking to each other, and losing the more individualized ways of doing so, rather than any like Twitter is suppressing our freedom of speech or anything like that. It is true that people are, of course, coming up with new ways of talking, coming up with new dialects at much faster rates than we probably did before, because we have these sort of memes spreading. And so I definitely don't think that like English is in any risk of ossifying. And we almost see this sort of branching off of dialects of English that are nearly mutually incomprehensible now, just because people are constructing new like social, new slang terms at such a fast rate. But yeah, I guess it's a very interesting time to be a linguist, and there's a lot to study that is at risk of dying. And it's difficult to know exactly how that's going to pan out in the future. But I think on the whole, I'm more worried about the loss of existing languages rather than the evolution of English.
Do we have time for a couple more, Lois? Yeah, amazing. There was a question that followed up on the languages question earlier. Are there any languages that are more prone to written than spoken poetry?
As in, I'm not quite sure what you'd mean by that. There are languages which work differently in written and spoken. So for instance, No, can you maybe change how you're asking that question?
So I'm just reading that question, but maybe
Okay.
the question that the person who asked might try to rephrase. Are there languages more prone to written than spoken poetry?
I think every language which has a written form would also have some form of written poetry. I don't think there's languages which don't have any form of written poetry.
Right, let's move on to the next one. And if the person who asked this question wants to come back, we will be in the WhatsApp group. A question that came in just now. What is your favorite word?
I really like the word iridescent.
What does it rhyme with?
Opalescent. And I like most words ending in escent are pretty good, to be honest, and you can get at least a reasonable rhyme out of all of them, and they relate to conceptually similar ideas. So something to do with how light plays on surfaces. So yeah.
Wonderful. A question that came in just after your sets poem was, is it possible for your brain not to get poetry?
Yeah, probably. I think that people sometimes just don't get rhythm, right? Some people, that just isn't a thing for some people. And I'm sure you can have that similarly for poetry. Some people don't get words, right? You can have aphasia, you can have the inability to speak. And I'm sure that there are similar conditions under which people just don't get poetry. I'm sure that there are also a list of interesting reasons why someone might feel like they're not getting poetry when really they're just being badly taught, though. And if you think you don't get poetry, probably you haven't encountered the sort of poetry that you would like, rather than your brain just doesn't work to process poetry. So
really the answer is read more poetry here.
Or listen to more poetry, or find different types of poetry. It might be that you don't like written poetry. I think it could just be very reasonable that someone doesn't really get that as a medium. And I think, I'm a spoken word artist, I prefer to hear poetry than to read poetry. And I think that's probably true of a lot of people these days.
There's a request, if you could share that Humans Are Viruses poem. It's a request from a biologist in the audience who would like to study it without the wine. So if you could do that.
It has just been accepted for publication in Consilience, so I can send you a link, but I cannot have it on the internet yet. But yeah, I will obviously publish links to it on Twitter, etc. As soon as it is. Yeah, this was the world premiere, I'm afraid. So it cannot exist in written form at the moment because of
you should have told us before this event, because that would have allowed us to ramp up the prices of the tickets, obviously. And last question is not related to poetry, but very important, and that is a question about social cost of carbon. So if we may, the person is asking, apart from migration and food shortages due to climate change, I'm struggling to think of other key headings. I'm guessing there are more. What are they?
Yeah, so actually the largest one is just that people don't like it when it's hot. It's difficult to sleep, and people have a bizarrely high range of tendency towards injury, and pretty much just things like breaking your ankle, for instance, get much worse when it's hot. You can just construct these curves of economic damage as a function of temperature. And yeah, people do just have reduced economic output when it's hot. They don't want to go outside. They don't want to do building work. They don't sleep as well. All sorts of really basic things like that have almost as much impact as things like the fact that the sea level rises and therefore there is less land to do things on, which obviously is also quite a big thing. And, reductioning productivity of crops, pretty big deal. But actually just really basic things sometimes matter quite a lot. It's hard to sleep when it's really hot.
Thank you very much. That's it for the questions. Over to you, Louise.
Thanks. That was absolutely fantastic, Robin. And the poetry was good enough that I can almost forgive you for hitting 2 of the 3 terrible scenario trifecta with mentioning both pandemics and global warming. Thank you for saving us from a poem about nuclear mass destruction. I appreciate it. No, but it was wonderful. And if we were in a real bar with real pints in our hand, people would be putting their pints down to give you a massive round of applause. Thank you very, very much. And I think that is our first ever world premiere of a poem. So massively appreciated.